Welcome, everyone. I'm Lisa Eiler, President and CEO of Alaska World Affairs Council. It's a pleasure today to feature David Bosco, who will be speaking about the Poseidon Project, the struggle to govern the world's oceans. It's a project exploring ocean governance and the law of the sea, which is particularly interesting for Alaskans due to our proximity to additional navigable waters in the Arctic and the heightened interest of many countries to utilize these passageways. And speaking of changes, the leaves have turned and we've had our first freeze in Alaska, or in Anchorage, excuse me. I hope the change in seasons is treating you well today and you've positioned yourself in a comfortable place for today's program. We're so glad you've joined us today. Today's program is part of the Evangeline Atwood Distinguished Speakers Series, first of our virtual programs. We have a lot of fun and interesting events coming up, so please visit our website or social media to find out more information. We will also run our slide deck at the end of our program to highlight our upcoming events in case you didn't see them earlier. So Alaska World Affairs Council is one of 90 plus world councils across the United States, and we welcome all who are joining us today. If you are not an Alaska World Affairs Council member, please consider joining this month to support these nonpartisan programs like the one here today. We are adding programs and events often, so please be sure to monitor our website and social media for upcoming events. On November 9th, we will have World Whiz Pub Quiz. It's a little bit of a tongue twister. World Trivia Night. It's going to be a lot of fun, so be sure to grab some friends and sign up a team. Also, our Alaska Airlines travel raffle is back. This is an easy way to support our mission while giving you a chance of winning 2 coach round-trip tickets. So if you're in Alaska, please purchase those raffle tickets. Today's program will be approximately 30 to 35 minutes by Mr. David Bosco, followed by a question and answer period. You can type your question in the Q&A. There's a little button on the bottom of your screen, and you can put your question in there. And I will read the question, or we might have some time to feature a few people on video as well. So right now, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. David Bosco is Executive Associate Dean of the Hamilton Lugar School of Global International Studies at Indiana University. In addition to the Poseidon Project, he is the author of books on the UN Security Council and on the International Criminal Court. A lawyer by training, he served as an attorney at an international law firm and worked in post-war Bosnia on refugee issues. He is a graduate of Harvard Law School, Cambridge University, and Harvard College. So please welcome David Bosco.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It is great to be with you. And I wish I were there in person. That had been the original plan, and then some events intervened that made it impossible. But I'm so delighted to be with you virtually, at least. I hope everybody can see the PowerPoint slides okay. I'm going to assume so. I wanted to walk through, essentially take you through a kind of historical voyage in terms of governance of the oceans and law of the sea, which is becoming a really important issue in a lot of different ways. And I think, people will be obviously aware of what's going on in the Arctic, the South China Sea, questions of fisheries, questions of ocean environmental protection. There are just multiple ways in which the oceans are very much in the news. One thing I just want to say by way of introduction is that this book is basically a kind of diplomatic history of how we got to where we are when it comes to ocean governance. I'm not really providing here a kind of policy prescription. And so I don't have a kind of list of here are the 5 things we need to do about the oceans. This is really more of a historical interpretation Although I should say, excuse me, I do have certainly a few policy ideas, and I'd be happy to discuss those in our question and answer. But I want people to understand that the book is primarily a diplomatic history. It's also got a Anglo-American slant to it. So the US and the UK feature very prominently in the book. And I think there's kind of a good defensible reason for that, and then maybe a less defensible reason. The defensible reason is that the US and the UK are the leading maritime powers, I should say, in sequence. The US now, the UK before it, were the leading maritime powers. And so they had a really outsized role in creating the system that we have of ocean governance. Somewhat less defensible, but I think candidly, it's also just in doing my research, it was a lot easier to find material on the US and the UK just because of archives and diplomatic access to diplomatic papers and everything was a lot easier on the US and UK side. So let me start my discussion here by taking you to the South China Sea, because I think that is maybe the area where maritime issues are at their most intense right now. And specifically, I want to talk to you about something the US Navy is doing fairly regularly in the South China Sea, which is what it titles freedom of navigation operations. So these are situations where the US Navy will send a ship through waters in the South China Sea that are claimed by some country. Sorry, I'm gonna. What the U.S. Navy is doing here is essentially asserting that it has the right to go into these waters, and that anyone who disputes that or claims that those waters are not open is going to have to deal with the U.S. Navy, essentially. And so the U.S. views this as challenging excessive maritime claims and defending freedom of the seas. This is particularly, of course, in relation to some of the Chinese claims in the South China Sea. And if you are interested, you can get into the details of what some of these freedom of navigation operations look like. It's things like sailing through the waters around the Paracel Islands, which is the image up here on the top right, and through waters that China claims to be its own waters. And the US will send a destroyer through there to say, look, we're going through here because we think international law allows us to go through there. And there's been a rise in the frequency and visibility of these operations in recent years. I should also say that while these are fairly common operations, there's a degree of danger to all of these, because you often have US vessels and aircraft sometimes in close proximity to Chinese vessels. And so you'll have Chinese vessels, Navy vessels kind of shadowing the US Navy as it does these, saying, we don't think you have the right to be here. The US saying, oh, yes, we do. So far, we haven't, fortunately, had a real incident recently, but that danger is always there, the danger of some kind of incident that escalates. When the US Navy does these freedom of navigation operations, it very much couches what it's doing in terms of international rules, international law, and preserving the freedom of the seas. Okay, the freedom of the seas comes up as a critical phrase almost every time that the US speaks about these freedom of navigation operations. And I want to say that in doing so, US spokespeople are connecting to something very significant in US history. That US history, US diplomatic history, US military history, the idea of freedom of the seas has been a very important theme. So it's not as if this is kind of coming out of nowhere. It's connecting with a powerful thread in U.S. diplomatic history. Woodrow Wilson, on the eve of World War I, described freedom of the seas as being sacred. Franklin Roosevelt was even more expansive when he talked about freedom of the seas. He argued that essentially all of American history has been tied up with freedom of the seas. Okay, so this is the diplomatic tradition that current U.S. policy is connecting with. So there's a lot of continuity there between the past, what the U.S. has said in the past about the oceans, what it's saying now. And in that sense, the current friction in the South China Sea can be viewed as the continuation, basically, of a historical struggle between what you can see as the desire of some countries to kind of control the oceans, control ocean space, and the desire of other countries to preserve ocean space as being open for everybody, open for all to use. And that, I don't want to actually tell you right now that that story is wrong, but I think that story is somewhat simplified and misses some important elements of what's been going on over the past century in particular. So what I try to do in the book is present a more complex picture of the diplomatic and legal history of the effort to craft rules for the oceans. That question of, can a country control the oceans versus countries trying to preserve freedom of the seas is an important part of that story. But I think the story is significantly more complex sometimes than diplomatic statements would lead you to believe. So let me take you then back in our historical voyage a little bit into history. And specifically, I want to take you to the late 1500s, early 1600s, when the Dutch are making an effort to break into the Indian Ocean trade. So the Dutch are trying to figure out, how do we become wealthier? How do we get involved in this lucrative spice trade in the Indian Ocean? And this at this point, that trade is very much dominated by Portugal. And Portugal and Spain, who, of course, Columbus, Vasco da Gama, they had kind of been some of the first to really figure out how the oceans work, to figure out the global connections between the oceans. And Spain and Portugal had actually fashioned an agreement between themselves that tried to, in essence, divvy up the world and divvy up the oceans between them. This is the so-called Treaty of Tordesillas. And the Dutch obviously did not appreciate that. They didn't like the idea that Spain and Portugal could draw a line through the oceans and say, this is the Spanish part, and the Portuguese could say, this is our part. And so after several times with Dutch vessels being interfered with, harassed by the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean, the Dutch finally decide we're going to take dramatic action. And so they seize the Santa Catarina, which was a Portuguese vessel loaded up with spices, and they sail it back to Amsterdam, and they auction off all the contents for a fairly healthy sum. And I think at that point, the Dutch kind of have a moment where they're like, wow, we just did that. We need to come up with an argument, a legal argument, as to why what we just did was acceptable. Because they were challenging powerful kind of globe-straddling countries here, and they wanted to come up with a legal argument. In doing so, they turned to Hugo Grotius, who was a quite young kind of prodigy, Dutch prodigy, who was a specialist in law and philosophy. And he wrote up a pamphlet, which was published in 1609, called Mare Liberum, which is basically the most coherent, succinct argument that had been made as to why the oceans should be open for all countries, why countries should not be able to do what Spain and Portugal had attempted to do. Now, Grotius was interesting in that he used, instead of using like scriptural arguments, biblical arguments, which is what, of course, many legal scholars at the time would have used, he tried to use natural law type arguments. So these are arguments just based on the nature of things and how from the nature of the oceans, we can deduce that the oceans should be open for all countries to use. And so you end up with, in this pamphlet then, a good statement of the doctrine of freedom of the seas, which is basically the following elements. Non-appropriation of ocean space. So countries shouldn't be able to claim and own parts of the ocean in the way that they can claim and own land. Freedom of all countries and all vessels to be able to navigate the oceans. Freedom to use the ocean's resources. So, you should be able to fish out there. You should be able to, use the resources of the oceans freely. Now, Grotius wasn't so concerned about freedom to conduct research on the oceans, but in later years, that obviously became another important freedom in terms of thinking of freedom of the seas. Grotius's argument got a response. So it wasn't as if everybody simply said, yes, you're right. Of course, the ocean should be free. There was a response that went on where essentially philosophers and lawyers at the time battled back and forth. And there was another pamphlet called Mare Clausum, written by an English scholar, that basically took on Grotius and said, no, I don't agree with you. I think the oceans can be owned just like the land. If you have a powerful enough navy, why can't you say this chunk of the oceans belongs to, this country? There's no logical reason why that shouldn't be the case. So this battle, so-called battle of the books, went on for a number of years between different scholars. Now, here I want to inject a little bit of power politics into the kind of legal and philosophical story, because in the broad sweep of history at this point, one of the most important developments is that Spain and Portugal are fading a bit as powers. The Dutch are also not quite able to compete. And it is really Britain, if we talk about the 17th and 18th centuries, Britain that is emerging as the dominant naval power. And what happens with the British here is quite interesting. The British, the English, I should say, really at that point, the English transition slowly kind of from a view that they should be able to own the oceans, because England claimed the English Channel, they claimed parts of the North Sea. They transitioned slowly away from that view to a Grotian view, where England starts to see itself as the protector of ocean freedom. And the image in the background here is a painting from the 1850s that portrays the image of Britannia. The female figure here carrying the trident is supposed to be Britannia. And then Britannia is receiving from Neptune the scepter and the crown of kind of overlordship of the ocean, but not overlordship in the sense of we own the ocean. Instead, we manage the ocean and we protect ocean freedom for everybody. So at the peak of English power in the early 1800s, they actually abandon claims to the English Channel and some of the other waters around England, waters that they used to claim were theirs. And they now say, no, they're not ours. They're open for everybody to use. So that's a big, important step that happens. Now, there's some other detail in there that I could talk about, but I want to keep going with the main thread of the argument here. So my argument is that the golden age then of freedom of the seas really comes about in the run-up, say, to World War I. Because Britain is the leading maritime power. They have, for the most part, adopted a Grotian view. They've given up their own claims to ocean space. They've also helped suppress piracy significantly, which is itself a very interesting story. There is booming maritime commerce. Fishing activity has expanded out into the oceans. Fishing historically was pretty much a coastal activity, but because of new technologies, new techniques, fishing really kind of goes global and goes out onto the high seas. So I would say the period before World War I is when you might be able to say that is really the high point of freedom of the seas. And one point I should make, during this period, the British were very aggressive about trying to insist that the maximum a country could claim of the oceans was 3 miles. Okay, so a coastal country is allowed, under even this Grotian model, they're allowed to say 3 miles out, we control that. This was referred to as the cannon shot rule, because the logic being, if a cannon could shoot at a certain point about 3 miles, and if you can shoot from shore 3 miles, you can kind of control those waters from shore, and therefore it makes sense that you should be able to kind of own those waters. But otherwise, if countries tried to go beyond the 3 mile mark, the British would often diplomatically and sometimes militarily intervene in order to reject those claims. Now, what I argue has happened is that if we look at the 20th century, basically from World War I onward, we have seen an unwinding of freedom of the seas, so that freedom of the seas is much more contested and much less a reality in some very important ways. Part of the story is military technology, and you saw during World War I and World War II massive closures of ocean space during the wars, with the Allies during World War I essentially trying to blockade the North Sea, close off all of the North Sea so that Germany didn't really have access to it. And then in World War II, of course, and in World War I, you had unrestricted submarine warfare, free fire zones, where you basically any vessel traveling through a certain zone was liable to be torpedoed. So these were, in military terms, huge interferences and unprecedented interferences with freedom of the seas. Then there's an important step that the US takes, and this is right in the wake of World War II in the Truman administration, which is the US unilaterally, and with very little consultation with allies or adversaries, says we are going to take more ocean space. Specifically, what Truman was talking about was control of the continental shelf. This is of course, the kind of area of shallow, of submerged land off of the coast where the waters are relatively shallow. In some places it goes out to 100 miles, some places 150, some places 300 miles. But the US said unilaterally, we control the continental shelf. And that led a bunch of other countries to say the same thing. And it led a bunch of other countries to start making even more ambitious claims, where they said, forget about just the continental shelf, we own the waters out to 100 miles or 200 miles. Some of the South American countries, Latin American countries, made claims that, we now have a 200-mile territorial sea. So this was happening in the 1950s, 1960s. So that means the cannon shot rule that a country can only claim out to 3 miles is really gone by the boards. And now we're in a world where countries are starting to claim lots and lots of the ocean as their own. The other thing, of course, going on here is that we've got resources, and that is the lure of resources, oil and gas. It's starting to be realized that you can drill for oil and gas, and that is luring countries farther out into the ocean and encouraging them to make stronger maritime claims. I'm going to skip this part of it because I want to make sure there's ample time for questions. But I would mention one other piece of the story here, which is that the other realization that is happening during this period, as we get into the 1960s, is an understanding of the environmental impact that kind of free and unrestrained use of the ocean can have. And here I have the image of Rachel Carson, of course. Rachel Carson is most famous for her book, Silent Spring, about pesticides. But if you look, Rachel Carson's earlier books were all about the oceans. So in many respects, she was somebody who focused on the oceans. And it's very interesting to read Rachel Carson from, say, 1956, where all her writing about the ocean is kind of full of wonder and isn't it amazing, the resources of the ocean and the life in the ocean, to shortly before her death in the early 1960s, much more alarmed about the harm that human beings can do to the ocean. And so Rachel Carson, of course, is kind of credited with having galvanized some of the modern environmental movement. And she was particularly concerned about the ways in which kind of free use of the oceans might actually lead to the destruction of the oceans. So what we end up with then is the Grotian model has really come under a lot of pressure and is really starting to fall apart, because countries are claiming much more of the oceans. They want the resources, and there's increased environmental concern about this. What we end up with is a very long, hard-fought diplomatic compromise. And this is negotiated during the 1970s into the early 1980s, and it ends up with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which we often refer to as UNCLOS. And this is basically still to this day the fundamental international document and the basis for international governance of the oceans. And what it ended up with was a compromise, in essence, between the Grotian worldview and the view that the kind of Tordesillas worldview that said countries can claim ocean space. And so you get a 12-mile territorial sea instead of the traditional 3 miles. You also get an exclusive economic zone, which goes out to 200 miles. So that means the coastal country has exclusive control of the economic resources out to 200 miles. And then there are lots of other details that we can talk about. So I think an important question then, as we try to sort all this out and figure out how does it mesh with the events that we're seeing today, is an important question is, have we reached a stable and workable equilibrium where we've given coastal states much more control of the oceans than they had in the past, in the kind of heyday of the Grotian era? But have we crafted a legal framework that works in terms of, environmental protection of the oceans, in terms of the desire of countries to be able to control resources, etc.? And I think the answer here is, from my perspective, is I don't know whether the equilibrium that we have today is stable or not. Let me give you a couple reasons why it may not be stable. Number one is that the United States, is the leading maritime power still, is not a member of the Law of the Sea Treaty. Okay, so the US, while it claims to be the main defender of the Law of the Sea, has not actually signed on to the treaty, and is not a part of the treaty process or any of the institutions that are associated with the treaty. And by that, I mean things like there's a special international court for ocean disputes. There's a special agency, international agency, that's supposed to manage any mining of the deep seabed, which is an important issue these days. because of the need for resources like nickel, cobalt, etc., much of which can be found on the ocean floor. The US isn't participating in those international bodies. So that's number one. The demand for ocean resources, however, is increasing. So we have the leading maritime power, which is kind of out of the system. And then the demand for ocean resources, as I've just mentioned with these minerals on the seabed, is increasing. Technology that enables countries to actually be able to control ocean space and monitor ocean space is increasing. So if you're a wealthy enough country and you've got underwater drones and you've got surveillance aircraft, you actually can have a very good picture, much better picture than in the past, of what's happening 300, 400 miles from your coast. And that, both the desire for ocean resources and the technological ability to monitor ocean space, mean that coastal countries could very well be tempted to claim more and to push back against the existing legal framework. Okay. And that, in essence, is what is happening, I think, with, situations like China in the South China Sea, where a powerful regional player feels like they shouldn't have to, let other countries' militaries operate a couple hundred miles from their coast, or they should be able to control all of the oil and gas drilling that goes on in the South China Sea. And it's not just China, because there are other countries that have a similar view. If you think about, for example, Turkey, if you think about some of the Latin American countries, there are clearly a number of significant countries that, if the right opportunity presented itself, would, I think, like to claim more ocean space. And you could see a fracturing of the internationally agreed framework for the oceans that we have. Okay, so basically I'm going to put that as one option, is we see more unilateralism, more China type claims to the ocean, and that eventually that leads to a fracturing of the international legal order that currently governs the oceans. Okay, so that's possibility number one. Possibility number two is the slide here, which is that instead of there being more unilateralism and increased national control of ocean space, there's more internationalization of the oceans. There's more international control of ocean space through, for example, some of these bodies that I mentioned, this international agency that tries to manage seabed mining. You've got international organizations that try to manage fisheries. Many of these are regional, so there'll be a regional fisheries organization, say, for a part of the ocean. There are other countries that have gotten together and tried to create marine protected areas, so chunks of the ocean where, say a group of 12 or 13 countries, here I'm showing you one off of the coast of Antarctica, where a group of countries get together and say, we are going to declare this area to be a marine protected area. So that means no drilling, that means no fishing, no exploitation otherwise of this area of the oceans. So the possibilities I want people to have in mind, I guess you could say the status quo is one possibility. So we've just kind of continue with the model that we have. You could say that more unilateralism, so more independent national claims on the ocean is a possibility number two. And then possibility number three is the increased international control of ocean space. Okay. But however, whichever of these works out, and I suppose it could be some combination of them, I think we are probably going to be moving farther and farther away from freedom of the seas as a kind of dominant doctrine, because freedom of the seas, while it was very important historically, is simply under so much pressure from so many different directions, be it environmental, be it strategic, be it military, that we may not be able to preserve nearly as much freedom of the seas as in the past. So that then, if we want to kind of end on, I do have to show, I've got to show this slide because it has the Barbie movie in it. This is just to show you the some of the friction and the level of intense concern in Asia about some of the maritime claims that China has been making. The Barbie movie was actually banned for a period. It may still be, I'm not 100% sure on this, in Vietnam, because there's this brief moment in the movie when a map of a kind of kids drawing of the world shows up behind Barbie, and you see these dashed lines off of Asia. There were several countries in the region who saw that as an endorsement of China's claims to the South China Sea, because a central feature of China's policy in the South China Sea is the so-called 9-dash line. And this looks kind of suspiciously like the 9-dash line. And so for that reason, the Barbie movie was at least temporarily banned in Vietnam. So I'm not leaving you, I'm afraid, in a very clear place. But I hope I'm leaving you in a more historically versed place where the story is not simply there are these kind of good countries out there trying to protect freedom of the seas, and then there are these kind of rapacious countries that want to control the oceans. The story is maybe partly that, but also a story about how in the world in general has been moving in the past century away from the doctrine of freedom of the seas as the centerpiece of ocean governance. So I'm sorry for kind of skipping around a bit on the slides, but I wanted to make sure I didn't spend too long, and make sure that I left adequate time for some back and forth. So why don't I leave it there, and I would be delighted to take any and all questions.
Thank you, David. That map on the from the Barbie movie was a riot. I don't know how many of us actually noticed that, so that's always fun to see. This has been a phenomenal analysis and excellent highlights from your book and Law of the Sea. I appreciate even your abbreviated version was interesting, so I really appreciate it. We have scheduled some time for some Q&A, and would like to shift gears to our questions here. So I'm going to start with one question that came in, and then we'll move to a live question after that. This does pertain to the South China Sea. It says, the United States has always been known to dominate the seas since maybe after World War II period. China has been growing their military dominance, specifically in the South China Sea. Can the United States maintain control to continue to maintain that freedom of navigation in the region, or is the U.S. going to step back a bit?
Yeah, that is a great question. And it's a military question in many respects. And I don't consider myself a kind of, military naval expert, but one of the things that naval experts are watching, of course, in the South China Sea is kind of the balance of forces. And, China has been on a major military, but also particularly a naval spending spree. And the number of ships and both Navy and Coast Guard, and also what they call a marine militia, which is sometimes kind of militarized fishing vessels, is really quite impressive. And so it is becoming a real challenge for the U.S. Navy and being able to say that we can project power in the South China Sea and that we can really deter China from taking steps that it would like to take is, I think, very much up in the air. But I see no sign right now, to go to the kind of thrust of the question. I don't see any sign right now that the U.S. is stepping back. To the contrary, the U.S. is amping up its participation in the region, amping up its cooperation with, say, Japan, with the Philippines, working with India to try to get India to be something of a counterweight to China, working with European partners, trying to encourage European navies, which have not traditionally been very active in the South China Sea, to get more active. And so you've seen some British ships, even a German ship a couple of years ago went through the South China Sea. So at the moment, I don't see any sign of the U.S. stepping back. And that leaves us in a dangerous place where Chinese capacity is growing. The U.S. appears determined to challenge Chinese claims. And I would be lying to you if I said, I really knew how this is going to play out. But no, I don't really see evidence of the U.S. stepping back.
Thank you. And now we're going to pivot to a live question. I think we have Mr. Paul Dunscombe on here. There you go. Is it Paul? Take the floor. You are muted.
Hi there, I'm here, yes.
Hi.
So very much appreciate the talk today. And you talked about a little bit about how this has evolved historically. One of the other interesting kind of historical parallels that I come up with this, especially when one talks about the extended continental shelf, and we haven't really even talked about ocean features. It's essentially kind of an extension of the great game to acquire national territory from land out onto the sea. And clearly one of the problems here is that coastal nations tend to abut other coastal nations, and therefore you inherently have these kinds of conflicts, and that's really kind of where the game seems to be playing out these days.
Yeah. Oh, no, I'm so glad you raised the extended continental shelf issue. So this is something that has been a kind of quiet struggle that's been going on since the agreement of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, because what the UN Convention permits, because to go to the question that was being raised, some countries have a continental shelf, say, that's 100 miles out from the coast, but some countries can really say, look, we have shallow water and a continental shelf that goes out to 350 miles or even further than that. And therefore, if the logic is the coastal country should control the continental shelf, shouldn't we be able to control out to 400 miles or wherever it goes down to the deep seabed? What the UN Convention sets up is a process. So it tries to internationalize basically this process. So countries that want to claim beyond 200 miles, everybody gets of the continental shelf. But beyond that, you don't have to, but you are encouraged to go through a UN committee where you submit to them all sorts of evidence about why, topographic evidence of, how you can show that the continental shelf extends out beyond 200 miles. So there are a bunch of these processes that are playing out right now where the UN is trying to rule on whether countries can claim more of the extended continental shelf. One of the big questions on this, going back to this kind of choice between unilateralism and multilateralism, is going to be whether countries abide by the decisions of the UN Commission, which is supposed to be examining all of these claims. The process has been very slow. In some cases, they've issued decisions and countries have more or less gone along, but we're going to have to see how that plays out. Another interesting footnote on the extended continental shelf is that the United States is about to finally release its own assertion of where its extended continental shelf is. And one of the questions I've been trying to follow is, what is the U.S. going to do? How is the U.S. going to make that announcement? Is it going to submit its claim or its demarcation to the UN Commission, or is it going to simply do it unilaterally? So that's going to be something interesting to watch. It could be in the next few months or year or so that this decision is finally taken. But yeah, I'm very glad that the questioner brought up that issue of the extended continental shelf.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question in the Q&A. Do you think the ocean effects of more dramatic climate challenges are more likely to lead to greater internationalization or unilateralization of the oceans? The recent and rapid increase of remarkable marine heat waves is just one example that comes to mind. Thanks for a terrific presentation.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I would say a lot of the environmental pressure, and particularly around climate change, is pushing kind of slowly, unevenly, not very satisfyingly, but toward the internationalization option. That a reckoning with the severe environmental consequences of climate change, which very much includes the ocean, has produced various international multilateral processes. Some of those obviously go well beyond the oceans. I mean, the fundamental climate change negotiations, et cetera. But parts of it are very much focused on the oceans. And so one thing that just happened in the last couple of months is that there was a kind of follow-on agreement to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And that follow-on agreement took several years to negotiate. But it basically recognized that, okay, we have this convention that was drafted in the 1980s. It doesn't really say much about the high seas, right? It explains, okay, you got a 12-mile territorial sea, you got a 200-mile exclusive economic zone. But if you look at the parts of the treaty that deal with the high seas, so beyond that 200 miles, it's very thin in terms of environmental protection of the high seas. And it was a realization of that then led to this diplomatic process of trying to negotiate a new treaty, which finally happened. Now, the treaty endorses the idea of, for example, creating these marine protected areas. So it really tries to encourage that, countries getting together and saying, even in part of the high seas, saying, we're going to agree to protect this area, to put it beyond, being damaged by human beings. So that we're going to have to watch how many countries finally ratify that treaty, how much impact it really has in terms of management of the oceans. But I think that's to go to the back to the question, that's a sign of kind of the multilateral push to deal with the oceans. The other thing that the question raises that is worth mentioning is that there's a group of countries that have a very particular, very keen interest in some of the climate change and how it's impacting the oceans, and that is small island nations. Because for a country like the United States, sea level rise, is a problem, but it's not an existential threat maybe. For a small island nation, if you have substantial sea level rise, you might actually lose most of your territory, perhaps your entire territory. And I think President Biden even made reference to this recently, perhaps in his speech to the UN. But for some of these small island countries, they are dealing with this existential threat caused by climate change and sea level rise. And for them, one of the important things is to make clear that even if they lose all or most of their territory, they don't lose their rights to that ocean space, that they don't kind of disappear then as a state, and they don't lose all of the their territorial sea and their exclusive economic zone. But that's a big looming question, is what impact sea level rise is going to have on some of these small island countries.
Very good, thank you. Okay, we have another live question Elizabeth? No, Elizabeth, go ahead with your question.
Hey, I'm here.
Hi.
Hey, we are Alaska, so we are interested in Arctic
Yes.
ocean issues. So I wonder if you could touch on what are the pros and cons of expanding Arctic shipping, and what are the potential flashpoints that we might have with other Arctic powers in doing so.
Okay. This is great. People are hitting on all of the issues that I was going to try to talk about, but kind of didn't have time. So yeah, so in the Arctic, first of all, the first thing to say about the Arctic is that the Arctic is covered by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Okay, so the Arctic isn't kind of some special carve out. It is covered by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So all of the basic rules about the law of the sea are going to apply in the Arctic. But there is a very particular issue, which I think is what you were getting at, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you were getting at is the question of the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route. Because if you're going to have substantial maritime commerce through the Arctic as the ice melts, it's going to be probably through these two routes, unless we have massive melting, and then you can kind of go across the heart of the Arctic Ocean. There is a latent dispute between, on the one hand, Canada, and then Canada versus the United States, and also versus some of the European countries, and then also Russia versus the United States and some other countries. And basically, the issue is this. Canada claims, based on how you draw the map of the Arctic archipelago, Canada claims that parts of the Northwest Passage, which is people probably realize the Northwest Passage is not one route, it's actually kind of a network of different possible routes. But whatever the case, any way you want to do the Northwest Passage, Canada says you have to pass through their internal waters. And that therefore, presumably you're going to need ultimately the permission of Canada to go through the Northwest Passage. The United States rejects that. The United States view is, nope, the Northwest Passage is international waters. It's an international strait, which is special, subject to special rules, special protection to make sure that no one country can close off commerce. So for the moment, I say this dispute is somewhat latent, that Canada and the US have kind of agreed to disagree about it. And also with Russia, there's more or less an agreement to disagree. But if these shipping routes become more and more viable as ice levels reduce, I think this issue is going to become less latent and more active. And one thing that the US has talked about periodically is whether it should do one of these freedom of navigation operations that it does in many parts of the world. Should it do one through the Northwest Passage or through the Northern Sea Route near Russia to demonstrate the US commitment to that being an international passageway? Now, here we get to an issue that I'm guessing a number of the listeners are well acquainted with, which is the issue of icebreakers. Because in talking to some of the Coast Guard folks in the research of this book, there is a real lack on the US side of icebreaker capability. And when the Coast Guard was approached, I think this was during the Obama administration, about maybe doing a freedom of navigation operation up in the Arctic, their response is, wow, we really have to think about this hard because we don't have a lot of icebreakers. Some of the ones we have are not operational. And if you're going to do a high stakes operation like this, you need to have icebreaker support. So I know that this has been a big concern for the US Coast Guard and the Navy, that lack of icebreaker capacity. And they'll often point out that Canada and Russia are much more capable in that respect. But I would definitely keep an eye on the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route as potential flashpoints going forward, because it's basically another iteration of that same question of how much of the oceans can coastal countries claim, with Canada and Russia kind of pushing farther out there than the US believes is appropriate. I hope that was somewhat responsive to Elizabeth's question.
Yeah, that was great. I know for the Alaskans online. Okay, so we have another question in Q&A. Could you address some of the fundamental reasons for the non-membership in the UN's Law of the Sea, US, please?
Yeah, another great question. So the US, and it is a kind of odd situation, because when the US does these freedom of navigation operations, it's using the language of international law. It is saying we are defending international law. And specifically, what the US is saying is we're defending the UNCLOS framework of 12-mile territorial sea, et cetera, et cetera. So why isn't the US a member? This goes back to during the negotiations, and the fundamental issue that kept the US from joining was the issue of seabed mining. Because the US did not fundamentally object to any of the key maritime zones that resulted, that were produced in UNCLOS. So the US doesn't mind the 12-mile territorial sea. It's fine with the 200-mile exclusive economic zone. So all those basic rules the US believes are good rules and rules that should be defended. What the US could not abide was that you were going to have an international agency that would manage mining of the deep seabed. And particularly the idea that there would be some profit sharing, so that if a US company wanted to mine the deep seabed, that it might have to share technology or share its profits with the international community. That was a non-starter for many US senators. And of course, if you're going to ratify the UN convention, it has to go through the Senate, and it has to get support of 2/3 of the Senate. So that was, historically speaking, the reason the US didn't join. I think those reasons may have changed a little bit. There are some other issues now, including the international court that exists for maritime disputes. Again, a number of senators don't like the idea of the US being subject to that kind of international scrutiny and international court rulings. So I wish I could say we're optimistic, but at the moment, I don't see much possibility of the UN convention getting through the Senate. I should say the US military wants to join. The US Navy wants to join, the Coast Guard. You know, admirals will go up and testify before Congress and say, this is why we want to join. Even a lot of US businesses who were sometimes skeptical, you know, a few decades ago, I think are increasingly in favor of the US joining. But it comes down to this fundamental kind of sovereignty objection to having international agencies and international courts that can more or less rule on what the US can do and not do. So I don't have great hopes that it will get passed. By the way, what I should say, how does the US defend the rules while not being a member of the convention? Here you have to get a little bit technical, but the legal argument that the US makes is that the basic rules about the breadth of the territorial sea, et cetera, those are all customary international law. That's what the US says. So even though we didn't sign on to the convention, we're bound by these rules and we're going to defend these rules. So that's customary international law. The US says the other stuff about seabed mining, that's part of the convention. We didn't sign the convention, and that's not customary international law. So we're not bound by that. That's not an argument that's convincing to a lot of international lawyers and to some US allies even, but that is the argument that the US makes.
All right. Well, I want to be respectful of everybody's lunch hour today. We are coming up. I can't believe it's already been an hour. That was a lot of information in a very short time. And thank you so very much, David, for joining us today. Again, we do wish you could have been here in person, but this was wonderful, and we will share the recording. There was, we'll have this presentation available on YouTube, so you can all share with others. Thank you all for joining us today. At
Thanks
Alaska.
for the great questions.
Say that again.
Oh, I just said thanks for the great questions. They were really
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yes. Well, it was wonderful to get these awesome answers. And thank you all for joining us and supporting our commitment to bringing quality educational programs to all of you. Remember to join us for the World Whiz Pub Quiz on November 9th. We thank you for your support and helping us bring the world to Alaska. And we hope you enjoyed the program today, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you so much, David.